The argument went back and forth. If you read Madison's notes, if you read Max Farrand, if you read any of the standard works which quote the debates in Philadelphia. We didn't win all those debates. We have a constitution that does have a Bill of Rights in it. It doesn't grant power. It restrains the government from exercising power. The Bill of Rights was written to restrain the federal government. Ultimately, it would be used in almost all instances to restrain all government. But there are majoritarian impulses in the Bill of Rights which undermine the notion that our liberties come from our humanity. So let's think of a few of them. Everybody knows this phrase: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. What's the most important word? The. Why? It represents the understanding of the drafters that the freedom of speech pre-existed the government. It pre-existed them. It already existed before they assembled in 1787. It reflected in the simplest of ways their understanding that the freedom of speech did not come from anything they wrote or created in 1787, but rather was being recognized by them as something that they and their successors must respect. And so the First Amendment gives us the restraint on the Congress with respect to expressive liberties. Fast forward a couple of years, we have the presidency of John Adams during the course of the French Revolution, when the government is afraid of the French. And as a result of this bizarre fear of French people, the government enacts the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically says if you are French, you have to live here for 14 years before you can become a citizen. It also says if you bring the president or the Congress into disrepute, you can be prosecuted for a felony. How could the same generation, in some instances the very same human beings who wrote Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, also author something as abominable as the Alien and Sedition Acts? Lou Rockwell and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, and he reminds me of what Augustine wrote about when he talked about libido dominandi. Now, don't get excited. We all have libido. We all know what that is. This is a different kind of libido. This is the lust to dominate. This is the thing in human nature that draws people to the government. Regrettably, there are far too few Ron Pauls in the government, and far too many people that suffer from this libido dominandi, this urge to dominate. So Congressman Matthew Lyon, an anti-federalist, a Jeffersonian from Vermont, thought that he would test the limits of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And he argued in public that John Adams, who was into puffery and pomp and circumstance and frills and wore almost regal-like clothing, in fact was more interested in pomp and circumstance than the government. That wasn't quite enough to provoke the Justice Department. But John Adams had a little problem with his waistline. I can understand that. And Congressman Lyons referred to the president as his rotundity. And that was the last straw for the Justice Department. So Congressman Lyons was indicted and charged as a sitting member of Congress. He didn't say it on the floor of the Congress. You know, if he had said it on the floor of the Congress, he couldn't be prosecuted because of a clause in the Constitution that insulates members of Congress from legal action against them for what they do and say on the floor. Patrick Kennedy was caught driving drunk at 3 o'clock in the morning and collided with a tree. Argued that he was on his way to the floor of the Congress at that hour and therefore couldn't be prosecuted for DUI. The constitutional protection of members of Congress doesn't go that far, but it does protect them for what they say on the floor. Congressman Lyons did not make this statement on the floor. He was charged, prosecuted, tried, and convicted of violating the Alien and Sedition Acts for making fun of the president's waistline. Now, if you're from New Jersey or New Orleans or Boston, you'll appreciate the second part of this story. Congressman Lyons ran for re-election from his jail cell, and he won. Eventually, of course, he returns to Congress. The Alien and Sedition Acts expire. They were sunset. Jefferson, of course, as the vice president, wasn't even protected by them. As you remember how presidents were elected in those days, everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first became president in the Electoral College. Whoever finished second became vice president. So you had the big government, somewhat overweight, pompous John Adams, the Federalist, and the very slim icon of liberty, Thomas Jefferson, the anti-federalist, as the vice president. Imagine the bizarre combinations today had this not been changed shortly after the calamitous election of 1800.